If it's Tuesday, former special counsel Robert Hur is grilled on the Hill. Democrats accuse him of playing politics because he commented on the president's memory, and Republicans accuse him of playing politics for not bringing charges. Plus, House lawmakers get a closed-door briefing from the nation's top intelligence officials as Congress weighs a nationwide crackdown and potential ban on TikTok. Key vote is set for tomorrow. And voters are voting in what's expected to be the last primary election day before President Biden and former President Trump have enough delegates to officially become their party's nominees, setting the stage for a long, bitter road to November. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yami Shalcender on a fiery day here in Washington today. Now, former special counsel Robert Hur defended his report on President Biden's handling of classified documents. In more than 4 hours of testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, Hur defended his decision not to recommend charges against the president. He also defended his report's assessment of President Biden's memory.
The evidence and the president himself put his memory squarely at issue. We interviewed the president and asked him about his recorded statement. Quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote. He told us that he didn't remember saying that to his ghostwriter. He also said he didn't remember finding any classified material in his home after his vice presidency. My assessment in the report about the relevance of the president's memory was necessary and accurate and fair. Most importantly, what I wrote is what I believe the evidence shows and what I expect jurors would perceive and believe. I explained to the Attorney General my decision and the reasons for it. That's what I was required to do.
The hearing came just hours after the Justice Department released the transcript of the special counsel's interview with the president. Democrats accused her of weaponizing the interview for political purposes by characterizing the president as a, quote, elderly man with a poor memory.
You could have written your report with comments about his specific recollection as to documents or a set of documents, but you chose a general pejorative reference to the president. You understood when you made that decision, didn't you, Mr. Hur, that you would ignite a political firestorm with that language, didn't you?
Congressman, politics played no part whatsoever in my investigative steps.
Are you a member of the Federalist Society?
I am not a member of the Federalist Society.
But you are a Republican, though, aren't you?
I am a registered Republican.
Yes, sir. And you're doing everything you can do to get President Trump reelected so that you can get appointed as a federal judge or perhaps to another position in the Department of Justice. Isn't that correct?
Congressman, I have no such aspirations, I can assure you, and I can tell you that partisan politics had no place whatsoever in my work. It had no place in the investigative steps that I took. It had no place in the decision that I made, and it had no place in a single word of my report.
So this lengthy, expensive, and independent investigation resulted in a complete exoneration of President Joe Biden.
I need to go back and make sure that I take note of the word that you used, exoneration. That is not a word that
I'm going to continue with my
questions.
I'm going to continue with my questions. I know that the term
I ultimately reached
I know that
whether
the term
sufficient evidence existed such that the likely outcome
you exonerated
would be a conviction.
I know that the term willful retention has a Mr. Hur, it's my time.
Hur, though, also faced criticism from Republicans who were angry he did not recommend the president face criminal charges as a result of his investigation.
You had the same facts, and the individual that you were investigating was 65 and had a good memory. Do you reach the same conclusion?
Congressman, as I responded earlier to a question along these lines, I am not here to entertain hypotheticals about facts or circumstances that may be different. What I did was assess the evidence and the facts that I obtained in this investigation and make a judgment based on this set of evidence.
Today's hearing highlights the challenges facing the DOJ. It's an election year in which the sitting president stands accused of mishandling classified documents, even if it doesn't rise to the level of criminality. And the presumptive Republican nominee, a former president himself, is facing federal charges for not only possessing classified documents, but also allegedly lying about it. To get us started today, I'm joined by NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memley, NBC News legal analyst and former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. So, Ryan, there is a lot to cover here. Democrats and Republicans, they really did have clear strategies. You could see it watching the hearing. What did each side here get out of today's hearing?
Yamisha, I don't know if either side really got too much out of what we saw take place over this lengthy hearing. Robert Hur knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what his responsibility was here, and he was not going to move too far outside of the guidelines that he established for himself when he released this report. Now, that being said, to your point, there was clearly a mission, at least a message that wanted to be sent out by both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats making the argument that it wasn't necessary to put that information out about the president's age and his memory, that the report could have been written without that detail. And they wanted to make it clear it doesn't have anything to do with his ability to do the job of president of the United States. Republicans, on the other hand, spend a lot of time. I'm surprised at how much time they spent comparing the prosecution of Donald Trump for classified documents to the ability for Joe Biden to not be prosecuted because of his mishandling of classified documents. In fact, they seem to spend more time trying to excuse away Donald Trump's issues than they did actually trying to point out the problems that they saw with the lack of prosecution of President Biden. And so, when you step away from this conversation, I don't know how many minds are going to be changed as a result of it, but it was clear that both Republicans and Democrats had a mission as they went into that hearing room today.
Certainly a mission, and there were certainly a lot of comparisons. Now, of course, it was Republicans, though, as we said, who called this hearing, who subpoenaed for the full transcript. I wonder, did they really set out and get what they set out to do here? Are they feeling good about what happened here?
I do have to say, Yamish, in general, Republicans do not have a very good track record when it comes to these high-profile hearings, particularly as it relates to the impeachment inquiry. A lot of their hearings which fall under that banner have fallen flat. They have not delivered in the way that they had hoped that they would do. A lot of times the members kind of go off on their own agendas. They don't fall in line with a kind of prescribed strategy that the chairman is looking for. That wasn't the case here today. You did not see members varying very much off the script that they had clearly laid out ahead of time. They wanted to get a certain set of points out and make those clear during this hearing. That certainly happened here today. Now, whether or not that leads to them moving to articles of impeachment, because don't forget, this is part of the impeachment inquiry, I'm still pretty skeptical of all of that. But if their goal was to try and buttress Donald Trump, to try and just put a little bit of doubt in the average voter about the way that he's being prosecuted for classified documents, even if some of the conclusions they drew weren't 100% accurate, it does appear that they at least accomplished that mission on some very slim level.
And Ryan, I have to ask you one other question, which is all this video that was played of former President Trump. You had Democrats really trying to highlight his memory lapses, his gaffes. How much do they think that's going to really impact voters when we know that a number of voters have said that they're very concerned about President Biden's memory?
Yeah, I wonder about that strategy too, Yamish. This was a hearing about President Biden. This was a hearing about President Biden's mishandling of classified documents. It was a hearing about questions that the special counsel had about President Biden's memory and his age and why that was a part of the report that he issued. But yet somehow Republicans and Democrats found ways to continue to bring the former president back into the conversation. And, Democrats didn't just talk about classified documents. They also brought up Donald Trump's cognitive ability. This is something that they talk about a lot. Whether or not that's going to resonate with voters, I think, remains to be seen.
Certainly a big question if it resonates with voters. Thank you so much, Ryan, for reporting for us on the Hill.
You.
Now, Mike, you were one of the first reporters to get your hand on this transcript. I know I woke up this morning literally reading your story. Tell me a bit about your biggest takeaways here, especially the nuance, because both sides wanted to get something out of this transcript, and you write that it was more balanced than maybe a lot of people thought.
Well, one of my takeaways has to do with hesitate to say the actual subject of the inquiry about the president's handling of classified information, because some of the most contentious backs and forth during these interviews over 2 days had to do with some real genuine disagreements about, for instance, whether these notebooks President Biden maintained while he was vice president were considered classified documents. He forcefully argued to her during the interview that these were his possession, that he was allowed to hold on to them. Now, of course, so much of this controversy has come down to his assessment of the president's age based on his memory lapses during the course of this. When you read the full, and it was 260 pages of this, you can see the fuller context. And yes, you do see the president multiple occasions misplacing a year, for instance, thinking out loud even at times. Was I still vice president when that was happening? That certainly backs up what Hur writes. But you also see the vice president Biden, I spent a lot of time covering, you covered as well, who who will take any hint of a story opportunity and then launch into that story. He was, for instance, recalling in great detail the trip he took to Mongolia in 2011. And so the White House certainly was eager to point to the fuller context to make the point that this was not an elderly man struggling with his mental faculties here in the way that Hur presented to the public.
Well, you talk about all the different things that were going on in there. There was the car sounds that he was making up. There was definitely a lot of Biden in this transcript, Biden the character that is. But I want to ask you, her pushback against public comments that Biden made when the report came out specifically. So take us through that. Explain what was going on there.
Well, there were two elements of pushback. One from the White House counsel and the president's own attorney before the report even came out, writing to her that he should not include, for instance, his characterizations of the president's age. That came before the report came out. What Matt Gaetz of Florida gave her the opportunity today to respond to the president's own words when he challenged the idea that there was classified information that he willfully retained. Let's take a listen to that exchange and Hur's response.
February 8th, the White House question, Mr. President, why did you share classified information with your ghostwriter? The president, I did not share classified information. I did not share it. I guarantee I did not. That's not true, is it, Mr. Hur?
That is inconsistent with the findings based on the evidence in my report.
Yes, it's a lie. It's just what regular people would say, right? Yeah, all right. So the next one. And all the stuff that was in my home was in filing cabinets that were either locked or able to be locked. That wasn't true either, was it?
That was inconsistent with the findings of our investigation.
So there was so much discussion of Mark Zwanitzer, who worked with the president when he was out of office to write that book. And again, this speaks to the president's view that these were not classified documents. He was allowed to have them. He also did, during the interview, pass the buck a bit to his staff, saying essentially there was no process. There were never discussions about how to wind down his vice presidential office, take belongings from his vice presidential residence, bring them back to Delaware. And he acknowledged, yeah, a lot of stuff ended up in boxes, but that wasn't his responsibility here. Obviously, Special Counsel Hur feels that there's some responsibility on the president's part, though.
Well, one of my favorite parts was also the First Lady saying, I don't want any parts of this organization. He didn't like his filing system. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for reporting for us on that transcript. And great article this morning. Chuck, thank you. Chuck, I wanted to talk to you as soon as this hearing was over because there was so much back and forth in this Judiciary Committee. What did you make of your justification of why Hur said he did not want to prosecute the president?
Sure. Well, if you're going to do an investigation, Yamiche, and you have to tell the Attorney General whether someone ought to be prosecuted or not, you absolutely have to give the Attorney General your rationale for that. And so, to that extent, completely appropriate for any prosecutor to tell any Attorney General why. What did I see? What did I hear? What did it feel like? Right? And so observations about someone's memory, their retention, maybe their bias, their motive to lie, whatever the factor may be. That is something that is properly in a report. Now, I've said this before. I think Mr. Hur could have written it with an eye toward the fact that it would be public and try not to use pejorative language. But the description's completely appropriate because an Attorney General needs to know your rationale for your recommendation.
Well, Chuck, to your point about the back and forth on the language, I want to play for you some sound between Representative Adam Schiff and the Democrats. They were pushing back on this idea of Hur saying that he wasn't naive, that he knew his words would become public. Can we play that?
What you are suggesting is that I needed to provide a different version of my report that would be fit for public release. That is nowhere in the rules. I was to prepare a confidential report that was comprehensive and thorough of an explanation.
What is in the rules, Mr. Hur, what is in the rules is you don't gratuitously do things to prejudice the subject of an investigation when you're declining to prosecute. You don't gratuitously add language that you know will be useful in a political campaign. You were not born yesterday. You understood exactly what you were doing.
You were not born yesterday. Tell me about your take on that exchange.
Well, I think it points out one of the fundamental flaws, Yamiche, in the special counsel regulations. Mr. Schiff was a former federal prosecutor, and he's getting at an important point with which I agree. Although I don't fault Rob Hur necessarily, I fault the regulations. It's this. When I was a federal prosecutor, I would prosecute some cases and decline others. When we declined cases, we never spoke publicly about our reason for declining a case. I think that is patently unfair. The special counsel regulations require the the special counsel to write a report. Rob Hur was saying accurately that he had to write a report and he had to include all of his observations. Mr. Schiff was saying accurately that the Department of Justice doesn't normally, routinely make declination memos or the rationale for a declination public. And so you have this conflict, which I think is a fundamental flaw of the special counsel regulations. They're both right. By the way, they're also both wrong. I think Rob could have been more careful in the language he used. And I think Mr. Schiff had to have acknowledged that Rob was following the regulations in preparing a report.
Both could be wrong and right.
I think so.
This is my take. And I also want to ask you about the politics of this. Special counsels are supposed to take the politics out of it. It's also supposed to, in some ways, help the integrity of the DOJ. Can that really be the case in this climate, especially over the last few years?
Oh, I don't think if that was the goal, I don't think it's worked. And in fact, I think in some ways the special counsel setup is corrosive to the Department of Justice because it suggests that the men and women at the department, and by the way, I'm biased because I come from that world. It suggests that the men and women of the Department of Justice cannot do complicated, sensitive, difficult work, when in fact I think they can. And moreover, the special counsel regulations leave the Attorney General in charge. He or she does not get as much distance as they might like. A special counsel is not an independent counsel. And so I think to your point, to your question, Yamiche, if the goal was to insulate the Department of Justice from politics, the special counsel regulations have failed.
Well, of course, you're the smartest take today, and it was a pleasure to talk with you, Chuck.
You're kind. Thank you.
And coming up, I'll talk to one of the Democratic lawmakers in the room during today's hearing. Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon will join me in the studio next. Plus, my interview with a top lawmaker who's helping lead the effort to crack down on TikTok and potentially ban it. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, comparisons of the investigation into President Biden to the former president, Donald Trump, featured heavily in today's special counsel hearing. Mr. Hur declined to bring charges against Mr. Biden, while the former president faces 40 criminal counts for his mishandling of classified documents. And in his report, the special counsel outlines one of the key differences in the two cases, writing, quote, most notably, after being given multiple chances to return classified documents and avoid prosecution, Mr. Trump allegedly did the opposite. According to the indictment, he not only refused to return the documents for many months, he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then to lie about it. In contrast, Mr. Biden turned in classified documents to the National Archives, and the Department of Justice consented to the search of multiple locations, including his homes, sat for a voluntary interview, and in other ways cooperated with the investigation. Joining me now on set is one of the lawmakers who was in the room during today's testimony, Pennsylvania Democratic Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for being here.
Certainly.
Now, you spent a portion of your questioning today making comparisons, as we just did, between former President Trump and President Biden. Why did you think that that was a good use of your time, given that this was, of course, Robert Hur?
Well, because Mr. Hur made that comparison. In his report, he explained that there were significant, I believe he called it material differences between the situation with Mr. Trump and the situation with President Biden. As you said, there was cooperation, there was immediate turning over of documents when they were discovered. And there was certainly no attempt to hide documents, get other people to hide documents or lie about what happened. And of course, we've seen recent evidence, even more evidence coming out about that with respect to Mr. Trump.
I want to ask you, obviously, Robert Hur did not investigate Trump, but a number of Democrats played video of former President Trump making gaffes, having memory lapses. What do you think the impact is of that playing a video is going to have, especially when you think about voters and where we are right now in the election season?
Well, I think we've all talked about the fact that there was undue attention paid to some of the gratuitous comments in Mr. Hur's report about President Biden not being able to remember a date or something, which actually we're seeing that some of those comments were overstated, given what we know about the transcript now. But the fact of the matter is that any time you bring in a witness or you have a trial and you ask people questions about something that happened years ago, they don't immediately recall what happened. And I thought it was important to highlight the fact that this is something that commonly happens, and to stress that the difference between the decision to charge Mr. Biden was because Mr. Hersh said he thought a jury would find Mr. Biden credible, even with memory lapses, and clearly the special counsel in Mr. Trump's case did not think he would be credible.
Now, Mr. Hur, there have been a number of reporting that he is sort of a unifying figure in that Democrats have their issues with him and Republicans have their issues with him. Several of your Democratic colleagues accused Mr. Hur of being unfairly political. Do you agree with that assessment of him?
I think he did a very comprehensive report, and he tried to explain his reasons for it. I also would note that some of my Republican colleagues also accused him of being unfairly political. So, you know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think there was a little bit of something for everyone in that report.
How, though, do you square both highlighting the fact that Robert Hur decided not to prosecute the president with also criticizing how he came to that conclusion? He's saying, I talked about his memory because I wanted to make sure it was clear why I didn't prosecute him. Why is that a problem? How do you square that, having a problem with that, with being happy in some ways about the actual conclusion he made?
Well, the issues about, you know, what he had to say about memory seemed a bit cherry-picked. I mean, particularly the stress, and some of our colleagues repeated that today, stressing whether or not Biden could remember saying something that he said in 2017 to someone in the course of dozens of hours of conversation about something that wasn't particularly relevant to the conversation at the time. So there was some cherry-picking there, maybe, but the overall point, and the thing that we really tried to get out there, was that the basic conclusion was there was nothing to charge here, that there was insufficient evidence, that there were, in fact, innocent explanations that would contradict that evidence. And that was the basis for the charging decision. There were multiple reasons for it, prime among them being the fact that there was not sufficient evidence.
And you talk about the conclusions of this report and investigation. Some of your colleagues, they repeatedly called it an exoneration. Let's take a listen to some of that.
In this case, did you reach a conclusion that this man was outright innocent?
That conclusion is not reflected in my report, sir.
Right. You did not reach an idea that he had committed no wrong. You reached a conclusion that you would not prevail at trial and therefore did not take it forward. Is that correct?
Correct, Congressman. I need to go back and make sure that I take note of the word that you used, exoneration. That is not a word that
I'm going to continue with my questions. I'm going to continue with my questions. I know that the term
I ultimately reached related to whether sufficient evidence existed such that the likely outcome
you exonerated
would be a conviction.
I know that the term will.
Some feisty exchanges, but the word exonerated in particular is what we want to focus on here. Do you think it's misleading to use the word exonerated here?
I don't know if it's misleading here. Certainly, there was an overall conclusion that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges here, and that there were innocent explanations that might also be available. But what it kept bringing to mind for me was the Mueller report, where that special counsel said if we could have exonerated the president, we would have, but we can't. So I think that's really more to the point of, if we're going to talk about exoneration, it actually was used in that.
Though today, Robert Hur, he pushed back repeatedly on the use of the word exoneration. So I want to, what do you make of that idea that he wanted to be clear over and over again that exonerated was not the word that he was using?
Well, I think that's consistent with being a prosecutor. The prosecutor's job is whether or not they're going to bring charges. The prosecutor's job is not to exonerate people, and they're not typically in the business of doing that.
I also want to ask you about this issue of classified documents. There was a point where we looked up and it was like everybody, almost every leader was looking in their house seeing, okay, do I have classified documents? Pence, former Vice President Mike Pence, all these different people were kind of putting their hands up to say, oh, I might have something. Do you want to see more security on the way that classified documents are being held? And if so, what would that look like? What do you want to see happen when it comes to classified documents?
Sure. I think it's a two-pronged issue. One is we've got this drumbeat of folks who say we overclassify things. There's a lot of things that are marked classified which really don't need to be classified. So with overclassification, it increases the possibility that documents are going to be out there that it's perfectly okay. Yes, we probably should have better tracking of these documents, and we need to work on that. But I do think it's really important to think about the fact that most of the documents we were talking about here were President Biden's personal notes. And that's a very different situation than, say, storing nuclear secrets and assessments of other foreign leaders in your bathroom.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as we pointed out, Robert Hur did say that there are differences here. I want to ask you a question about a completely different topic, which is Hakeem Jeffries, of course, the leader of the Democrats in the House. He's urging Democrats to sign a discharge petition to force a vote on the Senate-passed foreign aid bill. Did you support that? Would you support that?
I've already signed the discharge petition. That bill passed the Senate over a month, almost 2 months ago now. Our allies are in desperate need of aid. We need to get humanitarian relief to Palestine. There are border security issues in there. So, yes, I think it's an important national security bill that Speaker Johnson should put on the floor today.
Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman, for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, my one-on-one interview with the top Democrat on the House Select Committee on China as the House prepares to vote to crack down on the Chinese-owned social media platform TikTok. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The showdown between Congress and TikTok has reached a new flashpoint. Right now, lawmakers are forging ahead with legislation that would ban the popular app in the U.S. unless its Chinese owners sell it. Today, intelligence officials were on Capitol Hill to brief House lawmakers about the threat posed by TikTok. It comes as the House is set to vote on that bill tomorrow. If it gets to the president's desk, he has said he would sign it. TikTok is pushing back with a last-minute lobbying effort. Its CEO is expected to be on Capitol Hill this week to meet with senators. The app is also marshaling support of its users, urging them to contact their representative in Congress. The message says, quote, "The government will take away the community that you and millions of other Americans love." Joining me now is Democratic Congressman from Illinois, Raja Krishnamurthy. He is the ranking member of the China Select Committee, and he and Chairman Mike Gallagher introduced that bill that could ban TikTok. So thank you so much for being here, Congressman.
Hey, thanks, Yamiche.
Now, it's still unclear when the Senate will take up your legislation, but I want to play for you what some senators are saying about your bill. Take a listen.
I understand people like TikTok. I would like to keep TikTok running, but not have our data used by the Communist Chinese
How will you vote
Party.
on this?
I don't know yet. I mean, I'm just being honest with you. I am definitely conflicted.
I'll tell you, there are a lot of questions my colleagues are asking, myself included. I haven't come to a final decision as to whether or not it should be banned.
So, Congressman, you just got a classified briefing this afternoon. What is your message to senators in particular who may be on the fence about this legislation?
Well, first of all, this is not a ban. What we're calling for is a divestment of TikTok by ByteDance, its owner, which is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And really, this isn't about TikTok, it's about ByteDance. And I think that what we're hearing is the president wants this authority to be able to balance the legitimate concerns of people who are on the platform, who should continue to enjoy the platform, with the legitimate national security concerns that have to do with our adversary, the CCP, and what it does in terms of its access to data, as well as in manipulation of the algorithm on the platform.
But, Congressman, if they don't divest, you will ban them. And to be clear, you also put a 6-month deadline on this. So explain how you square that with the idea that you put this ban, you put the consequence of the ban on the table. That was your decision.
Yeah, so basically they would be suspended from being able to operate until they comply with the law. This is very common. We have various laws that basically prevent excess ownership with regard to broadcast outlets, telecom companies, even railroads. And so what we're saying here is they need to comply with that particular law. They need to reduce their ownership to no more than a 20% stake in the company. And at that point, they would be in compliance.
I understand what your view on that. I want to also ask you about something about former President Trump. He said he believes that TikTok poses a national security risk. He initially supported banning it. I know you're saying it would be suspended, but he also is reversing course here, is flipping the script. How worried are you that President Trump and him not supporting this bill, that it could tank it in the 11th hour?
Well, I think he's been flip-flopping and then flipping. Just the other day, he gave a rambling conversation interview with CNBC in which he said, you know, TikTok is absolutely a national security threat. I'm not really sure what exactly is motivating Donald Trump. Something tells me it has something to do with politics. Surprise, surprise. But the main point here is we have to do what is right. And what is right here is making sure that we ensure the divestment of the Chinese Communist Party and ByteDance with regard to TikTok.
Congressman, I also want to ask you about the constitutional issues that might be here. The ACLU has been critical of your bill, saying it would violate the First Amendment. They argue, quote, banning TikTok would have a profound implications for our constitutional right to free speech and free expression because millions of Americans rely on the app every day for information, communication, advocacy, and entertainment. So how would you respond to that argument? And are you concerned that this bill could end up being blocked by the courts because of those constitutional issues that the ACLU is bringing up?
No, there is no right. There's no First Amendment right to espionage. No, there's no First Amendment right to harm our national security. There are a number of cases, including Supreme Court cases, that basically say that even in a situation where, for instance, a bookstore is not in compliance with laws of general application, and even though obviously the authors and others who have the right to express themselves and the books contained in that bookstore should be able to sell them, if the bookstore is out of compliance, it's not allowed to operate until it's in compliance. And that's the situation here. Similarly, you know, broadcast outlets and other companies, we have foreign ownership limits or thresholds that can't be crossed. And I think that this is one of those situations where we don't want a foreign adversary's controlled social media app to basically harm our national security while we want people to continue to express themselves on the platform. I think that this law achieves the balance, and so people will be able to continue to do so. We have precedent here. There was Grindr, which is a LGBTQ app that was owned at one time by a Chinese company. Because we realized that the Chinese Communist Party had access to the sensitive personal data of LGBTQ members of the military and the government, we required divestment. That happened without a hitch. It happened quickly because Grindr was a valuable social media app, just as TikTok is, and there was no disruption of service, which is what we would expect here as well.
Well, Congressman, you talked about TikTok being a sort of bookstore. What if the president was in that bookstore? You have President Biden's campaign. As you know, they've joined TikTok. In fact, their campaign posted a new video today. Does that undermine in some ways your argument that this poses a national security threat if the president of the United States and his campaign is on it?
Well, I'm not going to tell the president how to campaign. I don't have TikTok on my own personal phone, and it's certainly banned from all government devices. But I think that everyone should use it very cautiously going forward. What I do know is what happened last week illustrates exactly why we need this particular bill. You may be aware that our particular bill passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction here, 50-0. That almost never happens, certainly not on the Energy and Commerce Committee. But the reason it happened is because TikTok, on the day of the vote, decided to use a push notification and a pop-up window on its app that required minor children, in order to be able to use the app, to call their member of Congress on the Energy and Commerce Committee to lobby against the bill in question. Well, when they called these offices, they flooded those offices with phone calls, by the way. These minor children basically asked the question, what is Congress and what is a congressman? And on top of that, in one case, they impersonated the child of one of the legislators. In another case, they actually called the congressman's office and said, I'm going to commit self-harm unless you turn on my TikTok. And so this illustrated in one example exactly why this particular legislation is necessary. Today, Christopher Wray at the Worldwide Threats hearing said in the open hearing, when I asked him about this particular example, he said he could not rule out that the CCP itself conducted this particular operation. So that is why we need this particular legislation.
We will certainly be watching this legislation. Thank you so much, Congressman, for your time.
Thank you.
After the break, the presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump vows to pardon January 6 rioters. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. In a social media post last night, former President Donald Trump wrote, quote, "My first acts as your next president will be to close the border, drill, baby, drill, and free the January 6 hostages being wrongfully imprisoned. While Trump has called on President Biden to release January 6 defendants in the past, we believe this is the first time Trump has explicitly pledged to pardon individuals who stormed the Capitol. Joining me now on set is Michael Schnell, congressional reporter for The Hill, Maria Teresa Cremar, president and CEO of Voto Latino, as well as an NBC News political analyst, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch. He's also an NBC News political analyst. A lot to talk about here. Now, Stephen, I want to start with you, Michael, because we should start with the fact that Trump advisors have said over and over again that they want him to focus on policy. But now he's talking about pardoning, releasing January 6 rioters. Can you tell me a little bit about what they think about this? And is this what they're talking about when they say he should be focusing on other things other than going off online?
Well, I'll note this isn't totally new for the former president, right? We've seen him say previously that he wants to release these January 6 hostages. We've seen him continue to talk about the 2021 riot, the 2020 presidential election to no avail. So this is nothing new. But I mean, I think a lot of folks want to see Trump focus on some of those policy matters, especially as we see poll after poll, specifically the issue of immigration. That tops #1 as the thing that's most important to voters this cycle. It's an issue that Republicans have been front and center on, that they've been leading the effort on. So I think that some folks would wish that former President Trump would focus more on that issue rather than relitigating the topic of January 6th, which really hasn't helped him.
But I want to stick with you, Michael, because both candidates want to talk about January 6th. Trump is talking about people as political hostages that stormed the Capitol. But you also have President Biden who's saying he's a threat to democracy and pointing to January 6th as a big example of that. Will voters care, you think, come November?
I mean, polls right now show that's not the main idea for them, right? And that's not their biggest issue. And we can tell that President Biden thinks that this is going to be salient with voters come November. It's one of the first issues he spoke about at his State of the Union address last week, right? So you can tell that he thinks it's going to be a salient issue. But again, those polls haven't shown it. But nonetheless, this has been one of the points that President Biden wants to bring up when he shows the difference between him and former President Trump, saying that, you know, this election is so important because the state and the fate of democracy is on the line. That's an issue that Democrats have been trying to hammer home. Whether or not it's going to be effective, we'll have to see. But it's one of those issues where there is a clear difference between the two candidates.
And Steve, I almost started with you because of course, the Republicans, I always want to ask Republicans, what do you make of the idea that the president is now wanting to sort of redo and create a new January 6th as a sort of event where people are now being held hostage for their First Amendment rights when instead of violently storming the Capitol?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a long project for Donald Trump, right? He's tried to rewrite the history of what happened on January 6th. And what's amazing is that he's been relatively successful if you look at the way that Republicans who answer polls are talking about these issues. They believe the election was stolen. A majority of Republicans believe the election was stolen. They're sympathetic to the argument that the people that we saw on videotape beating police officers with fire extinguishers, what have you, are now political hostages. So he's had some success. The thing I think that Michael points to that I think really creates a problem for other Republicans, they don't want to talk about this. I mean, nobody should be surprised that Donald Trump wants to talk about the things that involve Donald Trump and have him at the center. But they would rather be talking about immigration or taxes or too much spending or you name it, the border in particular. And they're not allowed to because they constantly get pulled back to talk about Donald Trump.
Maria says, jump in here. I mean, what do you make of this, of all that we've talked about, but especially the idea that these political hostages in President Trump's mind, former President Trump's mind, need to be released now?
Well, I think he just hasn't pivoted from the primary talking points that he needed, right? He actually needed MAGA Republicans to go out during the primaries to show that he was going to be the most formidable contender. But the closer we get to the election, you're going to have that 40% of independents that were voting for Haley saying, actually, I don't want someone that had an insurrection. So the more he reminds the general public of this, he's basically creating an unforced error for his campaign. God, you know, I never thought that I'd be advising him against this, but that's what's happening. And what I think that the Biden administration has to do is they should hammer home this idea that they basically, President Trump wanted to vacate 80 million voters and who voted for a different type of administration, which happened to be Biden. That's a big issue. And the closer we get to the campaign, to the election day, and the more that we see Trump's, you know, his courts going closer to the fall, more Americans are going to be paying attention to. And this idea that someone tried to steal an election through insurrection, not at the ballot box, just doesn't sit well with the majority of Americans, regardless of party.
Michael, I also want to ask you about a different topic, and this, of course, is a surprise announcement that Ken Buck, congressman, Republican. He's now going to be leaving Congress earlier than expected. We know that Speaker Johnson already had a pretty slim majority. What are you hearing from Republicans now that yet another person is leaving?
That this is going to make their job that much harder, right? I spoke to Congressman Don Bacon. He's a Republican from Nebraska, a more moderate Republican in the conference, and he said this is going to make matters more difficult. Let's look back at the past year. House Republicans have had such a difficult time to pass easy messaging things that are supposed to be simple. Impeaching DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. This was one of the centerpieces of their platforms when they took the Republican majority this last year, and they had to do it a second time because that failed. So Republicans are saying that this is going to make things even harder. And just to put, a fine point on the fact of how slim House Republicans' majority is right now, Don Bacon said this is essentially going to cut our majority by like a third because they only had that large of a majority. So by taking away one guy, it's that large of a percentage. I mean, Republicans have had a tough time. It can only get tougher from here on out as they lose that cushion.
Steve, how are Republicans going to navigate this?
I mean, very gingerly, I think. There's not a lot that I think Republicans can do. They've shown difficulty having cohesion even with a much bigger majority. But I think what Ken Buck did, I mean, he's been frustrated, right? He said he doesn't want to be in a party. He doesn't want to stay in Congress if he's going to be forced to lie for the leader of the party. He thinks Donald Trump is asking Republicans, and certainly we've seen this, to say things that aren't true on his behalf. It's a frustrating place to be if you're an elected member of Congress. Not that elected members of Congress always tell the truth. We should stipulate. But I think, we've seen this in other instances where you've had people leaving earlier. I think we're likely to see this in the future from more Republicans who say, I just can't do it anymore.
And Maria Teresa, I want to ask you about this, but I also want to play some sound for you. It's Donald Trump on the phone with CNBC talking about Social Security, Medicaid, the programs that we often call entitlement programs. Take a listen.
Have you changed your outlook on how to handle entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Mr. President?
There is a lot you can do in terms of entitlements, in terms of cutting, and in terms of also the theft and the bad management of entitlements, tremendous bad management of entitlements. There's tremendous amounts of things, numbers of things you can do.
Now, the Trump campaign is out pushing back a little bit, saying, oh, well, there's going to be waste here. But when you talk about what Republicans want to be talking about, they were heckling the president, President Biden, saying they're not going to cut Social Security. Right. How big is it that this is coming back?
I'm trying to figure out if he's actually for his campaign. In the last 24 hours, he's actually just lost Florida. Just like, no, but in all seriousness, he is not on message. And I can imagine the folks behind the room saying, wait a second, we are trying to navigate a very tense political climate where Social Security and your base happen to be older white Americans who depend on this. So how is he going to grow his base? I think it's very, very difficult.
But it's the worst possible answer. If you're a conservative who believes that we need entitlement reform, and with $35 trillion in debt, we ought to be thinking about how to responsibly reform entitlements and to offer proposals that are thoughtful, allow people who are dependent on them now to keep it, but reform it for future generations. He basically stepped on his own messaging there because he has said repeatedly since as long as he's been in politics, we're not touching Social Security. We're not touching Medicare. We're not touching Medicaid. So he frustrates the people in the Republican Party who are for reform. And then he gives a soundbite like that, which will undoubtedly be in commercials in the fall, saying there's a lot to cut with respect to entitlements. So he's basically having it bad both ways.
Certainly. A lot to talk about. Thank you so much to Michael, to Steve, to Maria Teresa. Thank you all. And still to come, if it's Tuesday, voters are voting. Former President Trump and President Biden are marching closer to victory. Both candidates are set to clinch their party's nominations as soon as tonight. We're live in Georgia. It's one of the 5 states holding primary contests today. Next, you're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. If it's Tuesday, voters are voting somewhere. Today, that somewhere is 4 states holding presidential primary contests, as well as the Northern Mariana Islands and Democrats living abroad. With no measurable opposition, both President Biden and former President Trump are expected to run the table on delegates. That would get them both to the threshold needed to win their party's nominations. Today, one of the states voting is battleground Georgia. It's a state President Biden flipped in 2020, and it's likely to be crucial this November. My colleague Nnamdi Amukwangu recently sat down with women leading that Republican Party in some of the largest counties in Georgia. They are trying to flip Georgia back.
The fight is on for battleground Georgia as Trump and Biden shift their focus to the general election.
Hello, Georgia.
This election cycle, Republican women in Metro Atlanta at the forefront of efforts to flip Georgia back to red.
The only path to the White House is through Georgia.
Stephanie Endress, Marcy McCarthy, and Sally Grubbs are leading the Fulton, DeKalb, and Cobb County Republican parties, each county in or around the Democratic stronghold of Atlanta, where Biden will need to keep his vote share high to hold the state for Democrats.
I think Republican voters are going to come out in droves.
A big part of the strategy? Convincing Republicans in their counties to vote, many of whom they say still question the legitimacy of Trump's loss in 2020.
How often do each of you field questions or concerns about election integrity or security? Like, do each of you still get approached?
Every single day of my life.
Absolutely. Every day.
Each chair working to engage Metro Atlanta Republicans, motivated by Trump's loss in 2020 to activate largely dormant party members.
The Democrat Party was definitely organized, and the Republican Party for Fulton County was not.
We have quadrupled in size in our membership.
The chairs also directly countering Democratic efforts to court women voters, data suggesting 6 in 10 suburban women supported Biden in 2020.
Do you think Donald Trump, the Republican Party, has a suburban women problem?
I think present day, no, because we see the aftermath of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the detrimental effects on our kitchen table politics.
Though noting the risk of leaning too heavily into that message.
Our future starts around kitchen tables just like this.
I'm curious what you all thought about Katie Britt's response to the State of the Union.
To have a woman sitting in the kitchen was kind of stunning to me. And, you know, in this perfectly spotless kind of kitchen was also kind of stunning to me.
McCarthy enlisting a diverse slate of down-ballot candidates.
What do you think the benefit is of running down-ballot candidates?
In 2022, in DeKalb County, in the second bluest county in the state of Georgia, by putting and inspiring 25 candidates to be on the primary ballot, we were able to double the Republican voter turnout.
At the crux of their efforts to flip Georgia red, the belief that Biden's low approval numbers, paired with an energized base of Metro Atlanta Republicans, could lead Trump to an easy victory.
If people want to fix the system, they've got to participate in it.
We have a lot of voters that are unhappy with the current administration, that are Biden remorse, and they're looking for something else. They want to return to what made America great to begin with.
And Nnamdi is on the ground with us in Georgia. Thanks so much for being here. So Nnamdi, it's interesting. That woman said, you know, why did that senator, why was she sitting in the kitchen and why was this empty, spotless kitchen? It's a striking thing for her to say. What else did these women tell you?
Well, you know, I asked them a lot of questions about how they're tailoring their message to, you know, recruit more moderate women voters, get them on their side, particularly on issues like abortion, which they concede Democrats have better messaging on. And the answer I got from them is they don't think they have to lean into abortion. The Cobb County Republican Party Chair Sally Grubbs told me it's settled law in Georgia. There's no point in us, you know, beating a dead horse over it. She'd rather talk about kitchen table issues. They're really leaning into the price of goods, inflations, and asking that question of, is your life better now, or was it better 4 years ago? And they're hoping that enough voters will say it was better 4 years ago.
And what do these women have to say on the issue of abortion? Because a lot of Republicans are split on that issue.
So it's very much, you know, along the same vein. In their eyes, they think it's not worth bringing it up. They acknowledge they may not be able to get many voters on their side with the topic of abortion. But when I asked them, hey, should the Republican Party consider changing its messaging around the issue, they said yes, but they needed to highlight that it's more of a personal responsibility thing, that, you know, we're not trying to take anyone's rights away. They really took issue with the phrase reproductive rights when I brought that up. And they say, you know, that's misleading. It's not about taking anyone's rights away. It's about encouraging personal responsibility, an argument that we used to hear that they, you know, want the conversation to return to.
And what do these voters want to hear from Donald Trump? I hear a lot of people who are focused on him, who are supportive of him, but who say they don't like the brashness, they don't like attacking people. What do these women have to say about him?
You know, I can say I heard that myself when I was talking to voters earlier today in Gwinnett County. I asked them that question directly. You know, does his personality need to be adjusted a little bit? And what I got told was not at all. That Donald Trump's appeal for many women is the fact that he tells it as it is, that he doesn't treat women like dainty flowers, but that he empowers them, as they phrase it to me. So in their eyes, they don't think Donald Trump needs to adjust his brand to get more women voters on their side. It's just a matter of hitting the ground, organizing, and ensuring women are hearing their message of, hey, things were cheaper, you felt safer when Donald Trump was in office.
Well, Nnamdi, it's so great to have you out there in Battleground, Georgia. Thank you for all your reporting. And we're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.